One of my favorite memories as a child was when my mother baked bread. The smell of the bread from the oven would drift all through the house. And no matter where you were, you could smell that wonderful loaf baking away in the oven, waiting for it to be done and cooled so we could put a lot of butter on it and drink it with a big glass of whole milk. And to me, that was a wonderful treat. And as I grew a little older, I was in the kitchen one time when my mother was making some bread, and she took out a little packet, a little packet of yeast, and she opened it up and she put in the dough and she punched it and rolled it, and then she set it on a plate and said, "Now, the yeast is going to make the dough rise." I didn't quite understand how any of that worked. I learned later on in high school science class that the yeast actually is a living organism and that it expands and emits gas inside the bread and makes the loaf rise. Well, in Jesus' day, they used yeast. Thing is, they didn't know it was yeast. You see, the microscope had not been invented yet. But they did know this. If you took some flour, mixed it with some water, and rolled it up into a ball, then stuck that ball in a jar and closed that lid tight and put it in the darkest corner of your house away from any sunlight, in a few days, a green mold would grow all around that ball, and it would smell real bad. And when you'd open up the jar, it was not pleasant at all. You see, that's yeast mold. That's where all yeast comes from. They didn't know about the yeast, but they knew that if you took a pinch of that green stuff from that ball and you mixed it in your flour, then the dough would rise. So this woman, she takes 3 measures of flour. Now you might think a measure is like a cup or 2 of flour. That's what I originally thought this meant. Not so. A measure of flour would be like a big bag of flour. She is using 3 bags of flour in this baking endeavor. As my dad would have said, that's a lot of punchki. Well, she's mixing a lot, and a lot is going to be raised by something very small. Something that on the face of it smells bad. Something on the face of it was hidden away in a corner. Something on the face of it you didn't disturb until you really needed it. Jesus says to these examples, this particular parable, he's describing the kingdom of heaven and what the kingdom of heaven may be likened to. So let's dig a little bit deeper into this parable. What's this leaven? We know what it is in terms of baking, but what's Jesus using it as an example of? He's using it as an example of himself. Because just like leaven, when leaven is referred to in the Old Testament, it's usually referred to in a negative way. Well, remember how Christ brought redemption to all of us. He brought redemption to us through something that the world saw as very negative, horrible death on a cross through crucifixion. The world at that time couldn't think of a more ghastly way to kill someone. And yet, through this something that the world would turn away from and say, that's just horrible and that's just terrible. Through that event, Jesus dies on the cross and rises. And he rises not just for himself, but he rises for all. There's no accident in the measures being described as 3 measures of wheat flour. The point Jesus is trying to make is, just as this woman takes this leaven and a huge amount of flour is raised, so too many will be raised from the dead and raised to eternal life through my death and my resurrection. So for everyone at home, everyone who's sitting watching us today from your house or your condo and your apartment, Here's something to think about doing. Bake some bread. Get some yeast and get some flour and bake whatever kind you want. And then as you watch that dough rise, think about Christ rising from the dead. And think about what a great gift it is for us. And as wonderful that smell was in the house when my mother baked that bread, it will fail in comparison to the wonderful sights and smell we will have when we appear in the heavenly kingdom.